The galaxy prefers to remember this moment as orderly, civilized, a necessary correction in the long arithmetic of survival. I remember it differently. I remember the silence before the vote, thick, reverent, false. From the crystalline balconies of the Senate ring, I looked down upon the hollow map where 1 billion stars glowed like captured fireflies. At the center of the chamber hovered a single pale blue projection, fragile as breath against vacuum. Earth, so small that it seemed absurd we had gathered empires to judge it. No human stood beneath that light. They never did. Humanity was discussed as one discusses weather or tectonic faults, forces to be managed, not voices to be heard. Their absence made deliberation efficient. It always does. The charges unfolded in calm, practiced tones: excessive internal conflict, accelerated weapons development, unregulated artificial intelligence, a species unwilling to submit to unified doctrine. Each accusation was accompanied by data streams, casualty graphs, probability spirals. Numbers are comforting. Numbers make fear sound rational. Yet fear was the true language spoken in that chamber. Humanity had risen too quickly. In less than 3 of their centuries, they had leapt from chemical fire to stellar engines. No elder species had guided them. No philosophical convergence councils had softened their instincts. They burned their way upward alone, and somehow did not burn out. My own people took 12 millennia to earn limited interstellar clearance. The humans tore open the dark like it owed them answers. When a delegate from the Keth Dominion spoke, his voice trembled despite the filters. He called humans dangerously adaptive. Another named them uncontainable. That statement echoed through me. I had studied humanity from afar. Their history was a catalog of near-extinction events: plagues, wars, environmental collapse. Each time they should have ended. Each time they endured. Not because they were wise, not because they were peaceful, but because they refused to accept conclusions written by others, or by nature itself. The final arguments were brief. By then, the decision had already calcified. The Concord does not truly vote. It confirms what fear has already chosen. When the sigils ignited across the chamber, red light rippled through the Senate ring like a wound opening in crystal. Exile was declared. Earth would be removed from all registered trade routes.
Jump corridors would be collapsed or rekeyed. Long-range relays silenced. No invasion, no bombardment. A slow suffocation, calibrated to appear merciful. Humanity would be left alone with its own planet until isolation did what war had not. Around me, delegates released pheromones of relief. Some bowed in prayer to probability. Others congratulated one another on preserving galactic stability. I did not join them, because I could not stop thinking about the absence at the center of the room, about how easily we had condemned a species without forcing them to kneel first, about how humans reacted, historically, when cornered. The chamber began to disperse. The hollow map dimmed. Earth's projection shrank, flagged now with exclusion markers and warning glyphs. Case closed. Civilization preserved. Then the observer alarm sang. At first it was dismissed as routine noise, sensor drift, stellar interference, but the tone persisted, sharp and insistent, cutting through the ceremonial calm. A junior analyst spoke aloud before protocol could stop her. The chamber stilled. Another voice followed, tighter now. Multiple vectors, orbital yards are active. I leaned forward, claws pressed to crystal, as data cascaded into view. Human fleets, unfinished, inelegant by our standards, were moving, not scrambling, not colliding in panic. Mobilizing. No distress calls were sent, no protests filed, no desperate appeals for reconsideration. Humanity did not rage against the verdict. They prepared. In that instant, I understood what the others did not. Exile assumes compliance. It assumes despair. It assumes a species will shrink when cut off from the greater whole. But humans had never relied on the galaxy to define their place within it. As the Senate adjourned in confusion and denial, one thought burned into my mind with terrible clarity. We had not just cast humanity out. We had given them time. And whatever they were preparing to become, it would not ask the galaxy for permission. The first reports were dismissed as censor error. That is how the irony began, quietly, politely, like a disease with no obvious symptoms. Within hours of the Exile declaration, our embargo protocols were still synchronizing across Concord space. Jump corridors had not fully collapsed, trade beacons still echoed. By every legal and logistical measure, humanity should have remained exactly where we left them, isolated, confused, scrambling to adapt. Instead, they vanished. Not in fragments.
Not in wreckage fields or emergency scatter patterns. Human vessels simply ceased to exist within known space. One moment present on long-range arrays, the next replaced by empty coordinates and unresolved sensor ghosts. At first, the High Council celebrated. "Compliance," one delegate announced, voice rich with satisfaction. I remember staring at the map, watching human markers blink out one by one, and feeling a cold certainty coil in my thorax. Humans did not accept verdicts delivered from above. They never had. Their own histories were filled with discarded gods, dethroned kings, rewritten ideologies. They tore down systems not when they failed, but when they grew inconvenient. Authority to humans was always provisional, conditional, something to test it until it broke. Why would they treat us any differently? As the hours stretched into cycles, celebration curdled into confusion. Patrol fleets found nothing. Interdiction nets caught no debris. There were no distress signals, no refugee surges, no evidence of collapse. Humanity had not fractured under Exile. They had executed a maneuver. It was the intelligence chambers that uncovered the truth, and even then, only in fragments. Deep archival scans revealed sealed research notes we had overlooked, hidden beneath civilian traffic, disguised as environmental or commercial initiatives. Experimental propulsion systems that ignored sanctioned physics, power sources designed for endurance, not efficiency, hulls built not for elegance, but for survival under impossible stress. They had been preparing for this, not days, not years, decades. Human star maps surfaced next, illicit, hand-stitched navigational webs extending beyond our charted borders, beyond the trade lanes, beyond the regions we marked as uninhabitable and never revisited, dead zones of gravitational shear and radiation storms, fractured volumes where our ships failed calibration and our laws of probability became unreliable. We had looked at those regions and seen only danger. Humans had looked at them and seen cover. The Concord convened again, urgency replacing ceremony. I watched analysts struggle to reconcile the scale of what they were seeing. Billions of individuals coordinating across a planet we believed fractured by politics and culture. No mass hysteria, no civil wars, no desperate last transmissions pleading for mercy. Cities dismantled themselves. That is the only phrase that fits.
Population centers were disassembled piece by piece, infrastructure rerouted into orbital construction, civilian industries converted overnight into logistics chains, agricultural zones shifted output without famine or revolt. The noise we expected, panic, chaos, defiance, never arrived. Instead, there was focus, purpose. I listened to intercepted human communications, what little leaked before they went fully dark. There was grief, yes, anger, fear, but threaded through it all was something that unsettled me far more than despair ever could. Resolve. They spoke not of fighting the Concord, not of revenge. They spoke of leaving, of continuity, of ensuring that whatever humanity became next would not be shaped by external judgment. Earth itself began to change. Orbital habitats multiplied. Surface installations powered down in deliberate sequences. Whole regions were evacuated, not chaotically, but methodically, as if following plans rehearsed long before the vote. It was as though humanity had already accepted a truth we were only beginning to understand. Earth was no longer the center of their survival. By the time our embargo fully activated, there was almost nothing left to contain. Humanity did not argue their sentence. They carried it out on their own terms. The final signal from Sol arrived unencrypted, unadorned, and brief. No accusation, no plea, just a burst of navigational noise, a signature flare marking the collapse of their last known jump vector. Then silence. A deliberate, chosen silence. In the intelligence chamber, I stood surrounded by beings who finally understood their mistake
and could not admit it aloud. We had designed Exile as erasure. We believed isolation would diminish humanity, reduce them to a forgotten anomaly on outdated star charts. But as I studied the empty map, something dreadful crystallized in my mind. They were not fleeing the galaxy. They were abandoning it, leaving behind the rules, the expectations, the slow, consensus-driven stagnation that defined us. They had stepped beyond our reach, into darkness we feared to follow, carrying with them a species-wide lesson learned through centuries of hardship. Survival favors those willing to change everything. As the last human markers faded from our instruments, a realization struck me with the force of gravitational collapse. Exile had failed. We had not removed a threat from the galaxy.
We had released one, unobserved, unrestrained, and growing somewhere beyond the edge of our certainty. And one day, I knew, humanity would return, not to ask forgiveness, but to show us what they had become in the dark. We called them dead zones. The name was not poetic, it was instructional, a warning embedded in language itself. Regions where gravitational vectors twisted without warning, where radiation storms scoured matter down to its molecular skeleton, where space-time fractured into unreliable layers that made navigation a gamble against mathematics. Nothing civilized endured there. No trade routes passed through. No colonies were authorized. Even our bravest explorers logged those coordinates, then politely pretended they did not exist. Humans went anyway. When their disappearance from known space stabilized into certainty, the Concorde authorized long-range reconnaissance, not rescue, confirmation. Exploration drones were dispatched along the edges of those forbidden regions, equipped with redundant cores and sacrificial navigation algorithms. None returned intact. Some vanished outright, their signal threads snapping as if cut. Others limped back as corrupted ghosts, data fragmented beyond clean reconstruction. But within the noise, within the radiation scars and gravitational distortions, patterns emerged. Human structures. At first we thought it misinterpretation, sensor echoes warped by relativistic shear, but repetition stripped away denial. Habitats anchored inside asteroid storms, power signatures burning steady beneath lethal radiation flux, shipyards assembled where our equations predicted total collapse. Physics itself rebelled. Humans adapted. They did not retreat when hulls failed. They redesigned hulls. They did not abandon bodies that sickened under cosmic radiation. They altered them. Gene therapy accelerated beyond anything the Concorde had sanctioned. Augmentations once debated ethically were implemented pragmatically. Survival outweighed philosophy. Engineering followed biology. Modular cities replaced fixed settlements. Reactors were built to fail gracefully rather than catastrophically. Redundancy became culture. Nothing was singular. Everything was replaceable, except the species itself. The high observers were unsettled, but not yet afraid. Survival alone does not make a threat. What disturbed them was the speed. Hardship did not merely challenge humanity, it refined them.
Scarcity bred innovation at a pace we could barely model. Isolation stripped away inefficiencies we had mistaken for civilization. They stopped thinking in terms of borders, currencies, and profit margins. Those concepts had meaning only when abundance allowed waste. In the dead zones, humanity thought in terms of continuation. Reports filtered in slowly, pieced together from half-blind probes and long baseline inference. Children were being born beneath artificial suns, compact stellar simulators engineered to provide stable light where no natural star could. Those children adapted faster than their parents. Radiation resistance increased within generations. Bone density shifted. Neuroplasticity spiked. Human evolution, once sluggish by cosmic standards, accelerated under pressure. Languages merged, not through decree, but necessity. Communication optimized itself. Redundant words fell away. Cultural myths condensed into shared narratives of exile and endurance. And warfare vanished. This surprised the Concorde most of all. They expected humans to turn on one another once stripped of external enemies and material excess. Instead, conflict became too expensive. Every death was a loss of irreplaceable experience. Every damaged habitat threatened all nearby lives. Division was no longer ideological, it was suicidal. Peace was not chosen out of enlightenment, it was enforced by reality. I watched these developments from afar, my role shifting quietly from analyst to witness. Each report contradicted our assumptions. Exile was meant to weaken humanity, to let entropy finish what politics began. Instead, exile forged them. I felt something then, something my species has no clean word for, a tightening beneath my carapace, a recognition that our judgment had revealed more about us than about them. Shame. We believed adversity would break humanity because it would have broken us. We built our civilizations within safety margins, beneath controlled skies, guided by elder hands. Humans had none of that. Their history was already a rehearsal for the dead zones. As cycles passed, the tone within the Concord shifted. Fear crept into deliberations, unspoken but pervasive. What emerged from those regions was no longer merely human as we understood it. They were becoming something shaped by extremes, hardened, unified, adaptive in ways our static models could not predict. And still, they did not return. No signals were sent toward us, no demands broadcast.
Humanity did not announce its survival. It waited. That waiting unsettled me more than any weapon could have. Species that seek recognition announce themselves. Species that seek dominance expand outward. Humanity did neither. They consolidated, they observed, they learned. From the edge of the dead zones, faint propulsion signatures pulsed rhythmically, test burns, controlled, disciplined. New ship silhouettes took form, built not for trade or exploration, but for endurance in hostile reality. I realized then that exile had granted humanity something we never intended: time, away from us. Time to shed old identities, time to become something the galaxy had never accounted for, something that no longer needed permission to exist. As I reviewed the latest data packet, one thought eclipsed all others, heavy as a collapsing star. When humanity finally chose to leave the dead zones, it would not be because they were forced out. It would be because they were ready. And whatever emerged from that darkness would not resemble the fragile blue dot we had voted to forget. The first human ship returned alone. No herald signal announced it. No breach alarm screamed in warning. It simply appeared at the outer margin of Concord-controlled space, an intrusion so clean, so precise, that our detection arrays hesitated, uncertain whether reality itself had misaligned. I was awake when the alert reached my chamber. I remember because my secondary heart stalled for nearly a full cycle as the visual feed resolved into clarity. The vessel was human, of that there was no doubt. Its mass, its proportions, the faint asymmetries that once defined their engineering philosophy, those signatures remained, but everything else was wrong. It carried no active weapon locks, no shield flares, no aggressive maneuvering profile. Its propulsion signature was unlike anything in our registries, not warp, not slip, not fold. Space around it behaved politely, as if persuaded rather than forced aside. The Concord panicked. Defense fleets scrambled from 3 sectors, orbital grids charged in cascading layers, automated threat doctrines activated without waiting for consensus. Generals who had never faced an actual war barked orders with performative confidence. I did not join them. I studied the ship. Its hull was sleek, grown rather than assembled, scarred by forces I could not immediately classify. There were no decorative elements, no insignia, no national markings.
It did not resemble the cluttered, experimental vessels humanity once fielded in its early expansion. This was not a ship built by committees or corporations. This was something born of exile. When the vessel finally transmitted, the signal was narrowband and deliberate, threaded directly into Concord diplomatic channels, as if it had always known exactly where to speak. A single figure appeared in the projection field: human, altered, familiar and alien in equal measure. Their posture was relaxed, not submissive, not defiant. Their eyes, adapted to spectra broader than our own, scanned the chamber with a focus that felt uncomfortably intimate. This was not a supplicant. This was not an invader. This was an envoy. They spoke without preamble. "We survived," the human said. Their voice was steady, unadorned by rhetoric. Murmurs rippled through the chamber, quickly silenced by protocol. The envoy continued, unbothered. "We are not here to reclaim Earth. We are not here to contest your verdict." A ripple of confusion followed. Some delegates exchanged gestures of relief. Others leaned forward, suspicious. I felt the opposite of relief. I felt the slow tightening of a truth approaching. Laughter broke out. Nervous, dismissive, relieved laughter. The Concord had prepared itself for accusations, for threats, even for war. A warning was manageable. Warnings could be ignored. One delegate clicked their mandibles and demanded clarification. The human paused, just long enough to ensure attention sharpened. Of what lives beyond the dead zones, they replied. Silence fell, not the ceremonial kind, but the involuntary stillness of predators sensing a larger presence nearby. The envoy gestured, and data flooded the chamber. At first, it appeared incomplete, star charts riddled with voids, sensor logs corrupted by interference. But patterns emerged as analysts worked in frantic synchrony. Entire systems gone, not destroyed in conventional terms, erased. Stellar masses collapsed into anomalies that defy classification. Civilizations older than the Concord, reduced to silence, without debris, without survivors. The timestamps were the most unsettling part. These events were not ancient. They were recent, ongoing, a slow, deliberate sweep. The chamber erupted. Demands for verification clashed with panicked denials. Some accused humanity of fabrication, of psychological warfare. Others recognized the signatures immediately, echoes of theoretical threats buried deep in forbidden archives. The human waited. When the noise subsided, they spoke again. "We did not encounter it by accident," they said. "We encountered it because we went where you would not. We survived where you could not." I felt my frills tighten in dread. First contact doctrine flashed through my mind, rewritten internally with horrifying clarity. Detection was not neutral. Observation itself could be an invitation. I asked before protocol could stop me. The envoy turned their gaze toward me. For a fraction of a second, I felt truly seen, not as a delegate, but as a thinking being weighed for relevance.
The hunters moved through space as if it were fluid, reshaping it around their forms. They did not maneuver, they flowed. Our weapons passed through them or were absorbed, their energy stripped and repurposed. Tactical simulations updated in real time and failed just as quickly. I watched from the command nexus as system after system went dark. Entire civilizations silenced in the time it took to issue a retreat order. The Concord had prepared for war against peers, against rebels, against rivals bound by physics, fear, and self-preservation. We had never prepared for something that did not recognize us as participants, only as terrain. Then the human ships arrived. They did not form up alongside our fleets. They did not request command authority. They cut directly across engagement zones, their drives tearing controlled wounds through space-time that our navigation arrays could barely track. Human vessels were smaller than Concord warships, cruder in appearance, but they moved with an intent that bordered on violence itself. They did not target the hunters directly. They targeted time. One human cruiser plunged straight into a collapsing gravity well, overloading its core to detonate inside the distortion left by a hunter's passage. The explosion did not damage the entity, but it delayed it. Seconds bought at the cost of a ship and everyone aboard. Seconds mattered. Another human formation deployed drones in erratic, suicidal patterns, forcing hunters to divert attention long enough for civilian evacuation corridors to open. A third group anchored themselves to a doomed star, using its impending collapse as a weaponized distraction. Their tactics were brutal, wasteful by our standards, illogical, effective. I struggled to reconcile what I was seeing. Humanity was not defending the Concord. They were not following our battle plans or respecting our lines. They fought as if extinction itself were the enemy, not us, not the hunters, but the end. World after world survived by margins measured in heartbeats. I saw a human carrier break apart under impossible stress, its hull venting atmosphere and debris. Escape pods marched, not away from danger, but toward it, slingshotting survivors through unstable vectors no Concord ship would have dared calculate. Humans died by the thousands in those early engagements. They died loudly, violently, without ceremony, and they died saving species that had voted to erase them. That was the moment my certainty fractured.
I had believed, quietly, rationally, that humanity's return was conditional, that their assistance would be transactional, aid exchanged for redemption, influence, or authority. But the data told a different story. Human ships withdrew only when evacuation was complete. They stayed in collapsing systems until the last non-human vessel escaped. They absorbed losses we would have deemed strategically unacceptable without hesitation. I did not understand it. During a brief lull, a rare pocket of survival carved from chaos, I found myself in direct communication with a human command node. The officer who appeared was wounded, one arm encased in emergency grafting, eyes bright with exhaustion and focus. Why do it? I asked them, abandoning formalities I no longer believed in. The human studied me for a moment, then glanced back at the tactical displays, where lives flickered like unstable stars. We did it because we were written off, the word struck with a force no weapon could match. Written off by councils, by probability curves, by those who decided survival was inefficient. Humanity had lived there, on the wrong side of every calculation, and instead of replicating our cruelty, they rejected it. That realization spread through the Concord faster than any alarm. Command hierarchies bent, doctrines shattered. For the first time since the hunters arrived, something like coordination began to form, not because we led it, but because humanity showed us how to endure. Still, the hunters advanced. They adapted even as humans did, altering patterns, bypassing sacrificial delays, learning from every engagement. What bought seconds yesterday bought milliseconds today. As casualty reports mounted and stars continued to vanish, I felt the shape of a deeper terror emerge. Humanity was slowing the end, not stopping it. And as the hunters adjusted their course, subtly, deliberately, toward the heart of Concord space, I understood the terrible truth that no strategy briefing dared to voice. This war was not about victory. It was about whether extinction would be sudden,
or whether someone would stand long enough for the galaxy to learn how to survive what was coming next. I began to notice patterns. At first, they were subtle, flashes of improvisation in the midst of chaos, small deviations from standard tactical expectations. But soon it became impossible to ignore. Humans fought differently, not because they possessed superior firepower, or faster engines, or sharper sensors.
They fought differently because they had lived differently. Exile had reshaped them. It had stripped away comforts we assumed were essential, dismantled hierarchies we believed necessary, and removed luxuries we relied upon to make planning possible. They were refined by deprivation, sculpted by uncertainty, and tempered by isolation. Where we froze when systems failed, humans improvised. I watched a carrier under multiple breaches not retreat into defensive formation, but divide into self-directed nodes, each module independently seeking escape vectors while protecting critical population pods. It looked chaotic at first glance. In fact, it was precise adaptation, fluid, decentralized, and impossible to predict. Where we retreated from threats beyond our comprehension, humans advanced. One frigate, battered and shieldless, navigated directly through a collapsing subspace rift, towing a civilian convoy behind it, ignoring the risk because the risk was measured not in lives lost, but in lives saved. Their decisions were rapid, confident, and fearless, not reckless, but calculated with a logic that no Concord manual could quantify. What astonished me most was how humans understood survival. It was never solitary, it was never abstract. Where other species calculate survival in probability matrices and resource ratios, humans calculated survival in meaning. Every action, every sacrifice, every desperate maneuver was threaded with purpose. They fought not merely to exist, but to ensure that existence carried value for themselves, for others, for worlds that had once judged them unworthy. I began documenting these behaviors. Initially, my notes were intended as intelligence reports, threat assessment, tactical analysis, predictive modeling. But the longer I observed, the less my reports resembled strategic profiles, and the more they resembled a guide to adaptation, to resilience, to survival beyond expectation. Each page became less about humanity as a military entity, and more about humanity as a lesson in living under impossible conditions. Theirs was a discipline born not of obedience, but of necessity. They cooperated without conformity, united without coercion. Decisions were made by consensus when feasible, by initiative when required, by instinct when no other choice existed. Authority was contextual, not absolute. They trusted each other, yet relied on themselves. Every soldier, every engineer, every civilian contributed to survival as if it were an art form. I observed how they balanced pragmatism with empathy. In engagements where we would have abandoned collateral populations, humans protected them, not because it was profitable, not because it was required, because it was possible, because the value of one life reinforced the value of the whole. Exile had taught them that abandonment comes with consequences, and they refused to repeat the errors of the galaxy that condemned them. Adaptation became instinctive, improvisation became tactical doctrine, sacrifice became a measured instrument wielded with precision and purpose. Their resilience was not a product of arrogance, but of humility. They understood the fragility of life intimately, and that understanding made them relentless. I began to recognize patterns in their strategic improvisations, loops of redundancy, layers of decentralized command, decision matrices based on real-time environmental inputs rather than theoretical models. They measured risk differently. They valued time differently. They valued cooperation differently. And yet, even amidst these observations, what impressed me most was subtle, almost invisible. Humanity fought with meaning, not survival alone, not victory alone. Purpose intertwined with action, morality intertwined with necessity. Every tactical choice carried a moral weight. Every improvisation carried a philosophical imprint. Exile had not only taught them to survive, it had taught them to choose survival worth choosing. I realized then that humanity was no longer simply a species to be measured in metrics or probabilities. They were a lesson in endurance, a guide in adaptation, a template for survival in ways the Concord had never imagined. And as I compiled my observations, I understood something that unsettled me deeper than any battle report ever could. What we had exiled, we had refined. What we had tried to isolate, we had educated.
What we feared, we had unknowingly perfected. I was no longer documenting a threat. I was documenting a phenomenon, a species that had been exiled, broken, and tested, and emerged transformed. Humanity had not simply survived, they had learned, and through observation, I began to learn alongside them. The war changed in the space we had always called forbidden. The dead zones, regions of distorted gravity, fractured spacetime, and radiation storms, had long been considered untouchable.
Generations of Concord strategists had cataloged them as impassable. Ships were tested in simulators, and theories predicted failure in hours at most. Entire campaigns had been ruled out simply because crossing into that chaos was considered suicidal. Humans saw it differently. Their fleet approached the edge of a dead zone like hunters stalking prey, moving deliberately into what we had codified as unknowable. Sensors registered warp fluctuations bending unpredictably, hull stress monitors screaming failure long before any vessel even crossed the threshold. Our analysts were aghast. Every prediction suggested collapse, massive loss of life, mission failure, annihilation. But humans did not retreat. They did not attempt to overpower the hunters with overwhelming firepower. That was not their strategy. Instead, they entered the maelstrom and became part of it, allowing the chaos that terrified us to dictate the terms of engagement, but on their terms. Ships fragmented and reformed, scattering across gravity wells and radiation belts, but always connected by improvised relay networks. Fleet nodes acted independently, improvising continuously, responding to shifting threats that even the most advanced Concord simulations could not anticipate. Every vessel became simultaneously predator and shield, using the environment itself as a weapon. The hunters followed. Curiosity, or perhaps instinct, drew them into the labyrinth we had called impossible. Their forms rippled through subspace, and for the first time the unstoppable felt vulnerable. The dead zone did not defeat them, but it slowed them, eroding their coordinated assaults. Humans, by contrast, thrived. They endured where we faltered. Systems failed, hulls breached, bridges collapsed, but human ingenuity never stopped. They improvised shields from debris, rerouted power through damaged conduits, and executed repairs mid-combat that defied logic. Every delay they imposed, every second they extracted, bought survival for planets previously condemned. I watched, documenting in disbelief. Where we would have fallen apart, humans adapted. Where we would have panicked, they advanced. Their resilience was not instinctive alone. It was deliberate, disciplined, and endlessly recursive. They did not seek to control the environment. They accepted it, molded themselves to it, and emerged stronger. The hunters' advantage diminished. Their assaults became slower, less coordinated.
Each strike they launched was countered not by brute force, but by human endurance and creativity. They were not winning battles. They were surviving them better than anyone had imagined possible. I began to understand what had always been the core of human strength. They did not fight to dominate. They fought to endure. Their victories were measured not in destroyed enemies, but in the continuation of life under impossible conditions. By the time the outer reaches of the dead zone were reached, the hunters were frustrated, diverted, and systematically worn down. It was not a conquest that humans achieved. It was endurance. The tide had turned, not because the humans had superior weapons, but because they had learned to live where others would die. The war was no longer about firepower. It was about patience, adaptation, and the refusal to yield. And for the first time since the hunters had arrived, hope returned. Not for the Concord, not for the galaxy, but for the possibility that a species exiled and tested could redefine the limits of survival itself. The dead zone, which had once been our cautionary boundary, had become humanity's crucible, and through it they were reforging the outcome of the war. Victory was within reach. From my observation posts I could see it clearly. Escape routes unguarded, corridors to distant, unclaimed space open, systems untouched by the hunters' advance. Human ships could have left, carrying their species far beyond the reach of any threat, beyond the maelstrom of chaos that had claimed so many others. Safety, survival, and the freedom to begin anew lay within their grasp. But they did not leave. I watched as human commanders gathered in ad hoc councils aboard battered carriers and orbital stations. Communication arrays linked every fleet node, signals pulsed with clarity and purpose. Decisions were made rapidly, sometimes without the benefit of full data, sometimes on instinct honed by centuries of exile.
The conclusion was unanimous: stay. Not because they had no choice, not because circumstance trapped them. They stayed because they chose to. It was a decision born of something deeper than strategy, something beyond instinct or survival. Humanity had endured exile, adapted to dead zones, fought the hunters, and survived the unimaginable. They could have claimed the stars for themselves, abandoned the galaxy to its fate, and continued their evolution in isolation. But they did not. They stayed to protect worlds that had once condemned them. They stayed to confront a threat that dwarfed any single species. They stayed because they understood that survival meant more than existence. It meant responsibility. I recorded every maneuver, every command, every sacrifice. Fleets formed protective screens around vulnerable systems. Damaged ships continued to provide cover for convoys carrying refugees, their crews improvising repairs on the fly. Logistics and combat flowed seamlessly into one another. Humans did not merely fight, they ensured continuity. I realized then that humanity's victories were not measured by conquest or destruction. They were measured by choice, by courage, by the willingness to remain when leaving would have been easier, safer, and more rational. The hunters, for all their power, could not understand this. Extinction is the natural law they obeyed, the inevitable endpoint of any species. Humans had learned to defy inevitability, not by brute force, but by will and adaptation. And in that defiance, I recognized a truth that unsettled me. Earth's exile had forged something the galaxy had never anticipated. Humans were no longer merely survivors, they were guardians. Not of Earth, not of humanity alone, but of life itself. In choosing to stay, they declared something more profound than victory. They declared that endurance without purpose is meaningless, that survival without responsibility is hollow, that the measure of a species is not how it escapes danger, but how it confronts it when no one else will. I documented their decision in awe, aware that the choice to remain would become the fulcrum upon which the galaxy's fate now pivoted. Humanity had transcended the limitations imposed upon it by exile, by doubt, and by fear. And in that choice, they had transformed from the accused to the arbiters of survival. The galaxy watched them, uncertain, terrified, and in that silence, I understood. Humans did not merely endure, they decided what the galaxy should become. And nothing would ever be the same. When the hunters finally withdrew, the galaxy was unrecognizable. Entire sectors had gone dark. Systems that had flourished for millennia were reduced to drifting remnants. Communication hubs were obliterated. Supply lines severed. Empires that once prided themselves on meticulous control now floundered in chaos, their bureaucracies meaningless against the devastation that had swept through.
The Concord itself, once a paragon of order, was fractured, its councils divided, its fleets diminished, its authority in question. And humanity remained, not as conquerors, not as overlords, not as rulers claiming the remnants of a fallen galaxy. They stayed, but their presence was quiet, deliberate, almost invisible to those not paying close attention. Their fleets patrolled, yes, but not to assert dominance. Human engineers, soldiers, and planners moved from system to system, restoring infrastructure, repairing habitats, reconnecting supply lines. They shared knowledge, facilitated reconstruction, trained local populations, but they never imposed command. Leadership, they explained, is not about ruling. I remember a human officer speaking in a recovered communication relay, addressing a coalition of shattered empires. We stand last when others cannot. It was a concept alien to our species, which equated governance with authority, command with control, influence with power. Humans did not seek to dominate. They did not seek gratitude or allegiance. They sought only to ensure continuity, to offer stability so that others might endure. I watched humans coordinate relief efforts across countless worlds. Billions of individuals worked in decentralized networks, improvising solutions in real time, adapting to environmental hazards, logistical challenges, and socio-political chaos. Where Concord forces froze under conflicting directives, humans improvised.
Where systems collapsed under fear or indecision, humans advanced. They did not collect titles or territories. They did not codify their intervention into law. Instead, they moved quietly, deliberately, like currents stabilizing a storm-tossed sea. Every action carried purpose. Every decision carried the weight of responsibility, yet none bore arrogance. And slowly, imperceptibly, the galaxy began to heal. Systems once considered lost were restored, trade routes reopened, civilizations reconnected, knowledge recovered, new alliances formed, not under coercion, but through shared survival and trust cultivated in the crucible of war. I observed it all with growing understanding. Exile had forged more than survival skills. It had forged empathy, restraint, and a profound sense of communal responsibility. Humans acted as caretakers, not conquerors, teachers, not tyrants. When the galaxy finally paused to breathe, I realized something extraordinary.
Humans had returned from the brink, not for power, not for glory, but to remind every species that endurance carries a moral dimension. Survival without purpose is fleeting. Strength without responsibility is hollow. True leadership, they demonstrated, is measured not by those who command first, but by those who stand last, bearing the burdens no one else can. And in that silence after the hunters, the galaxy learned a new truth. Humanity had been exiled to teach the universe what it had forgotten, that survival is not an act of domination, but an act of care. And through that lesson, they reshaped everything. I teach this history now, not as instruction, not as doctrine, not as the proud recitation of the Concord's decisions. I teach it as repentance, as a confession, as a reminder that fear, unchecked and unexamined, can shape history in ways no law or council could anticipate. We feared humans. We feared them because they refused to stay small, because they clawed upward, unassisted, defiant, refusing the gentle guidance the galaxy thought it owed them, because their survival was not contingent on our permission, nor their progress on our sanction. Every leap they took, every crisis they endured, became a mirror reflecting our own complacency, and we recoiled. We exiled them. The vote was unanimous, or so it seemed. Charges enumerated, probabilities calculated. The logic of centuries of galactic jurisprudence pressed into the chambers like crystal weights. We told ourselves it was precaution, necessity, survival. We told ourselves we were preserving order, but we were preserving control. In doing so, we made a choice that would define the galaxy. We cast out a species not to diminish their potential, but because it frightened us, because we could not guide them, regulate them, bend them to consensus, or shape them into predictable patterns. And in that act, we forged legends. Humanity did not need us to sanction their rise. They did not need our fleets, our laws, our permissions. They survived anyway. They adapted, endured, and grew into something extraordinary, not in spite of exile, but because of it. They became the only species capable of saving the galaxy from the hunters, capable of teaching us resilience, capable of demonstrating that true strength is measured not in obedience, but in purpose, adaptation, and moral courage. I document these lessons for my people now. We study their tactics, their choices, their endurance, but most importantly, we study their spirit. We remember the arrogance of our councils and the fear that guided them, and we recognize the humility we should have felt all along. Humanity needed no approval. They never had. And in that, I see the truth of our failing and the brilliance of theirs. Extraordinary does not seek permission. Extraordinary defies expectation, rises through adversity, and reshapes the universe simply by refusing to remain small. I call them legends. And we, the Concord, my people, every observer who once judged, will never forget that we exiled them, not because they deserved it, but because we did not deserve them yet. And yet somehow in their exile, humanity became the measure against which all others must now be judged.